of the Discovery shuttle. On board, an American hero, 77 years old. It's history in the making. John Glenn, a pioneer, returns.
We interrupt our regularly scheduled programming to bring you the following special presentation live on the Discovery Channel.
You are looking at the Space Shuttle Discovery, filled with almost 4 million pounds of rocket fuel, ready to blast off 30 minutes from now. Inside are 7 astronauts, including a 77-year-old man poised to make history again. The last time John Glenn ventured into space, he traveled in a rocket that had exploded in almost half its test launches. Still, he climbed in calmly, ignoring the risk,
We're underway.
meeting the challenge,
0G, and I feel fine, Captain.
returning a hero. Today, 36 years later, John Glenn is back to meet a new challenge, to fulfill his dream of returning to space.
From the Discovery Channel and ABC News, a Discovery News special report. John Glenn, a pioneer, returns. Live from the Kennedy Space Center in Florida, here's Steve Avison.
Hello, and welcome to this special edition of Discovery News. Not since the early days of space exploration has a rocket launch here at Kennedy Space Center captured so much attention and created so much excitement. Millions of people around the world are watching this event. President Clinton arrived this morning. Tourists have been gathering by the hundreds near the launch site. Visitors have been gathering since the early morning at the Smithsonian Air and Space Museum in Washington, D.C. and students at John Glenn High School in New Concord, Ohio. All of this attention is focused on one man, John Glenn. The last time he traveled into space, it was 1962, when he became the first American to orbit the Earth. Today, he aims to make history again, to become the oldest person ever to travel into space. Welcome, everyone. Joining me is astronaut Blaine Hammond, who has piloted 2 shuttle missions. And Blaine, Discovery is kind of home base for you. You piloted the shuttle twice, and it was Discovery both times. But this time around, there are 4,000 journalists gathered. Did you ever get that much attention for one of your flights?
No, Steve. Well, I don't think we did. It was hard to tell when you're sitting up there 3 miles from all this. But we really should have. You know, every space shuttle mission deserves this kind of attention. It's just great to see it back and at this level again.
Now, ironically, you're retired from NASA. You were 10 years old when John Glenn first went up into space. Does this flight have anything special meaning for you?
Yes, I figure about the time I'm Senator Glenn's age, we'll be going to Mars, and I can look forward and ask to call me back to go to Mars.
That'd be very nice indeed. Well, let's set the stage for people. What's been happening today as we've gone forward here. This morning, the astronauts had breakfast. They suited up. That's customary.
Normal, yes.
There's a special camera. Where is this camera located where we're able to see John Glenn and his mates actually putting on helmets and...
Well, there's a suit room over in the operations and checkout building where they suit up before they go down to the van and then go out to the pad. But right now, as you're probably being able to see, there's a special camera located inside both on the flight deck and the mid deck to allow the folks at home to watch as the commander and his crew are all strapped in individually.
What's going through your mind as you're making your way to the launch pad and then getting on board?
Well, there's a lot of excitement and apprehension. You know, you're worried that, I think the biggest thing is not fear like everybody might think, but just the anticipation of almost like a new amusement park ride that you're excited about going on. Just hope that you get your chance and that nothing breaks to get in the way and stop you from going.
Suddenly the hatch is locked and you know you're going to be on your back for 2 or more hours. What does that feel like?
Well, you realize you're alone. You're one of 7 people out there. The nearest person is 3 miles away shortly thereafter, and it's kind of a lonely feeling out there, but you got your crewmates. There's a lot of good-natured bantering going on, a lot of joking, and really, it's, you know, for my cruise, it was a good time. We had some time to reflect on things and talk about what we're going to do and look forward to it. So we're really all excited and anxious to go.
That banter is not something that John Glenn had the benefit of the first time around. We wonder what it would be like for him to sit in this particular location, the different than sitting on top of an Atlas rocket 36 years ago. Joining us now from the Air and Space Museum in Washington, D.C. is veteran astronaut Jerry Lininger, who is standing in front of Friendship 7, the original capsule that John Glenn rode into space. Jerry, you lived on the Russian space station Mir for more than 4 months. Can you imagine blasting off in that 6 by 9 foot capsule?
That's a tight little capsule. I definitely wouldn't want to be living on that thing for 4 or 5 months.
Now, you had some good company in one of your flights. Blaine Hammond was one of your partners.
Blaine and I were on Discovery, and looking at those films, man, I'll tell you, I just wish I was crawling in again today.
I can add to that, too. Jerry and I both, we had a great time, and it was probably one of the best crews you could ever hope for, and I don't think I could have gotten a better crew if I had stayed around and flew after that. But we had a great time. Jerry was our only rookie, and we enjoyed taking him and watching him and enjoy space.
I wonder what it's going to be like for, you know, Captain Thomas to observe Senator Glenn up there as a first-timer.
I don't know. It should be an interesting thing for Kurt Brown to watch John Glenn and see how he does and see how he learns to adjust to this new environment, because in John's first flight he didn't have a chance to really get to float around and experience the joys and the problems of flying in
Well, today space makes exploration seem almost routine, but in the early days it was extremely hazardous. Ned Potter now takes a look at why John Glenn was the right man for the challenge then and now.
It is easy to forget what a scary world it was at the dawn of the space age. The Cold War was at its most chilling. The Soviets had already launched the first satellite, the first dog, the first cosmonaut.
And all at once here were these bunch of people we looked at as sort of backward Bolsheviks over there who were literally outdoing the United States of America.
The U.S. was desperate to catch up, but almost everything it tried failed. America did not just need better boosters, it needed bigger heroes. It found 7, and the one with whom it fell most in love was John Glenn.
If you've seen all of the rockets that had blown up on television previously, there was certainly every expectation that John Glenn's rocket was going to blow up like the rest of them.
But it did not.
Roger, backup clock is started.
John Glenn orbited Earth 3 times, restored America's pride, and breathed new life into the U.S. space program.
Before this decade is out, of landing a man on the moon and returning him safely to the Earth.
America won the space race.
That's one small step for man.
The Soviets never did make it to the moon. The Soviet Union faltered and eventually collapsed.
This is the end, in a sense, of the heroic era of spaceflight. I mean, it's a very visible punctuation mark to a romantic era of taking high risks.
Today, the right stuff is defined differently. NASA looks less for pilots than PhDs. Shuttle missions seem routine. So where's the excitement? In watching John Glenn having the time of his life.
Well, I am, and I tell you, I've never worked harder in my life.
There's still something in Glenn that lives on the edge, pushes limits, and that perhaps is why America still seems so taken with its returning pioneer. Ned Potter, ABC News.
Let's look again at the size of the capsule that Glenn rode on his first flight. And to show you how much bigger the shuttle really is, let's go to ABC News correspondent Bill Blakemore, who is at the Visitor Center here, standing next to a life-size replica. Bill, compared to Friendship 7, the shuttle looks enormous. He's traveling business class this time around.
Exactly. You could tuck Friendship 7 into the nose of the shuttle, which is as big as a DC-9 and far more complex. The shuttle is, in fact, the most complex spacecraft that's ever been built. It's got 2 million parts. It's got 230 miles of wire, 950 switches for everybody to keep track of. It's got 5 computers on board, which is 5 more than they had on Friendship 7. The shuttle is basically designed as a large space truck. It can lift 65,000 pounds of cargo up into orbit with each flight, and as with most trucks, the area for the humans is squeezed right up there into the front end. When I took a tour, I discovered there are only 2 small rooms, one right on top of the other, and the top room is right behind those windows.
Go to the carpenter thing, we may not.
The upper room, or flight deck, is barely larger across than your outstretched arms. This is where the commander and the pilot sit, and during launch there will be 2 extra chairs folded out here for other crew members. Overhead, there are 2 windows, often used for looking down at Earth. To get to the middeck, they float there through this hole in the floor. The middeck is about twice the size of the flight deck above. During launch, 3 more fold-out chairs, John Glenn right here in the center. They sleep weightless in sleeping bags attached to any surface they want. Over here, a tiny kitchen complete with a little oven. Right next to it, the hatch they first entered from. And in the corner, the facilities. On some flights, including this one, they connect a third module where they can live and work, slightly larger than a walk-in closet, right here in the cargo bay. We're joined by John Pike, who's a space policy analyst from the Federation of American Scientists. John, NASA's been saying the science that John Glenn will be doing here is important for NASA. Do you agree?
Well, I think that it's certainly scientifically valid research. I don't think anybody's going to be winning any Nobel Prizes. There's simply no way that this is going to produce big medical breakthroughs.
So there's certainly a PR element. Do you think that's important?
I think it's extremely important that NASA's doing what it's done all along, demonstrating national leadership and reenacting the national myth, exciting Americans and inspiring them.
So some public support may come from that.
I hope that NASA's budget's going to be increased as a result of this, but I'm not holding my breath.
Very good. John Pike, thank you very much. Back to you, Steve.
Thank you, Bill. There's been a lot of talk about the wording of the send-off the astronauts will get just before launch. Last time that John Glenn flew into space, astronaut Scott Carpenter uttered a famous phrase.
5, 4, 3, 2, 1, 0. Godspeed, John Glenn.
As you think about the speed this man is going to achieve pretty quick, and it was just sort of an automatic statement/prayer that came to me.
And we're told that Scott Carpenter is back. In fact, he's there right now. I'm not sure if we can hear that, but Scott Carpenter once again has spoken to his comrades on the shuttle Discovery. This has become a common phrase, hasn't it?
Right, Steve. Typically, before launch in the Launch Control Center, as they come out of the T-9 hold or just before, the launch director will poll the room for a go. And the last people polled are the crew. And typically, once the crew gives a go, the orbiter test conductor will wish them well and usually use the word Godspeed. And obviously, this is a holdover tradition that seems to carry forward each mission.
A tradition begun by Scott Carpenter and continued today. We're going to take a quick break. When we come back, we'll explain minute by minute the events leading up to today's launch.
Also coming up, from heart gauges to brain nets, what NASA researchers hope to learn from John Glenn. And the evolution of the spacesuit, from simple protection to full-scale survival gear. And if there's trouble on the launch pad, the options for a fast escape.
John Glenn, A Pioneer Returns continues. Once again, Steve Avison.
Welcome back. About 250,000 people are on hand to witness John Glenn's return to space. About 4,000 of them, as we reported, are journalists. Glenn may be getting most of the attention, but he actually holds the lowest position, a payload specialist. There are 6 other crew members on this shuttle flight. Scott Parazynski, a medical doctor and 2-time shuttle veteran, was just 7 months old when Glenn first orbited the Earth. For him, this mission is a dream come true.
Getting a chance to fly with your boyhood hero, John Glenn, is almost like science fiction.
All right, Commander Kurt Brown and pilot Stephen Lindsay flew with the Air Force. Brown has already logged almost 1,000 hours in space, 200 times more than Glenn. 43-year-old Steve Robinson is happy to have the senator on board.
If it weren't for him, I'd be the oldest guy on the flight.
Actually, Chiaki Mukai, a heart surgeon from Japan, is a little older. She's 46. The youngest on board, 35-year-old Pedro Duque, a Spanish astronaut who was born a year after Glenn's famous flight. Blaine, your training as a pilot began for NASA in the mid-'80s. How has that changed from the beginning?
Well, Steve, in the beginning, as you've probably heard on the news, John Glenn, they didn't have much capability to control the Mercury capsule, so they had very little to worry about flying it. But the shuttle, on the other hand, is a very unique, tremendous flying machine that requires special skills. In spite of thousands of hours of flying time, you still have to kind of start from scratch and learn how to fly it in a special way. And requires several hundred approaches before you can even become qualified to be just the pilot or co-pilot.
This time around, John Glenn is not a pilot, but he is a payload specialist. Let's show you what John Glenn has been doing to prepare. He has dangled from a crane, spun around in a centrifuge, driven a launch rescue vehicle at breakneck speeds, rappelled down the side of the shuttle. But most of Glenn's training was spent doing this.
We have to understand everything we know.
For up to 50 hours a week, Glenn hit the books, even studying geography so he can take pictures from space. When he wasn't in class, he was getting hands-on experience with the 17 experiments he'll run.
Why don't you come on over here?
The rest of his training was an introduction to shuttle life, how to sleep, move around, pick a menu, prepare the food, clean up, and a few other things. But the toughest part of training, Glenn says, has been learning how to use a laptop computer for the first time.
You go File, and you go Save As.
A good part of my life was the pre-computer age, and everything now is done on computers, of course, so I've had to do a little extra work catching up in some of those areas.
Much of Glenn's training is to prepare him to be a guinea pig, a human guinea pig for aging experiments. Joining us now from Mission Control in Houston is Ronald White, the former chief of NASA's Life Sciences Division, now with the National Space Biomedical Institute at Baylor University. Welcome, Dr. White. What is it exactly that happens to the human body in space?
Well, Steve, when gravity gets turned off, since gravity is the force that causes weight in the body, there are three major effects that occur instantaneously. First, the kind of information that a wide array of receptors that the body has in place in order to give us information about the environment and to tell us which way down is, something that's very important to know so that we don't fall unexpectedly. This information is different. Wait a minute, I'm getting a feed in my ear. All right, the information then confuses the brain, and the brain has to react to that. Secondly, the body is mostly composed of water. A normal body has about 10 or 12 gallons of water inside of it, and the water has weight. And because the water has weight, it's distributed in a certain way when we walk around, mainly in the lower portions of the body, the legs and the torso.
Will there be specific different effects on a 77-year-old body? Will they be dramatically different?
Well, no, I think they'll be very, very similar to the kinds of effects that we see on other people. There's no reason to expect that age changes the gross effects on the body.
All right, Dr. White, thank you very much. We'll get back to you a little bit later in the broadcast. Thanks for being with us. John Glenn's return to space has a special resonance for millions of senior citizens around the world. ABC correspondent Barry Seraphin is in Titusville, a town close to the launch site, with some of them. Barry?
Well, Steve, I'm one of thousands of people who have taken up positions along the roadways, waterways, and parks for miles and miles around here. There are people of all ages from all over the country. But among them, there are some veteran space watchers. I'd like you to meet one of them. This is Bob Hudson. Bob, your family ran the newspaper here for a long time.
Sure did, right here in Titusville.
You've watched a lot of launches. What do you think about this one?
Oh, it's great. It's wonderful. It's a tremendous crowd.
Now, you're 78 years old today. This is a heck of a party you're throwing.
Oh, it sure is. A great party for me.
What do you think about that youngster, John Glenn, going into space?
I think it's wonderful, and I'd go in a heartbeat if I could. John is a wonderful person, and when he comes back down, he's going to prove that seniors have a lot to give this country.
Okay, thank you, Bob. It's been a party atmosphere. Now it's grown a little quiet. People are on their feet. A lot of anticipation. Steve?
Thanks very much, Barry. I think those sentiments are reflected not only by seniors, but aspiring seniors as well. The people watching here are so excited that many of them are not thinking about the danger. But John Glenn's family has had to live with it. If anyone knows the risks of space travel, it's John Glenn.
It's a hazardous business, and everybody knows that. But you weigh against that risk, you also weigh the benefits that may come from that flight.
The first time around, the risks were enormous. When Glenn brought his family to see a test launch, the rocket exploded. His daughter was 14 years old.
I can remember being shocked and stunned and overwhelmed and questioning both my mom and dad about whether this was going to happen to him.
But her father didn't back down. From the launch pad, he made a final phone call to his wife, Annie.
He said that he was just going down to the corner to get chewing gum. And that brings tears to my eyes even now, because I didn't know maybe that was going to be our last conversation.
Space travel is safer now, but there are still dangers. Worries that Glenn's family had to overcome once again.
Annie and my two kids were a little cool to this idea, but they're enthusiastic about it now too.
Knowing that Glenn's mission is more important to him than the risk.
It is T-minus 9 minutes and holding briefly here at the Kennedy Space Center. The countdown continues when we return.
When we come back, backup plans for an emergency. Making a quick exit if there's any sign of trouble. And a blueprint of the launch. A minute-by-minute explanation of what to look for during and after liftoff.
We have a 3-minute delay at this point in the countdown. Now, Blaine, at the 9-minute point, there is always a customary 10-minute delay, but this is extending beyond that.
Yeah, that's right, Steve. Normally the 10-minute hold is to give the launch team a chance to evaluate all the systems one more time, and as we're hearing now, it seems that there may have been a master alarm go off in the cockpit that is giving them concern to look at and understand what caused it. They seem to be very confident from what we're hearing on the loops that it's something they can resolve very quickly, and it seems to be tied to a pressurization problem that may have occurred when they were going through their pressurization and leak checks of the cabin before they continue the countdown.
And Blaine, you just made reference to something called a loop. We've got two sources of information here. One is New York, who we're talking to, and the other is NASA Select. There is a launch commentator who is communicating directly with the cockpit. Is that correct?
That's correct. Well, actually, no, that's not correct. Lisa Malone is a commentator who is relaying this information across NASA Select as what's going on.
That's for people like us.
Right.
All right.
And actually, in the Mission Control or in Launch Control Center, they have the loops. They can talk directly to the crew and amongst themselves, and that's the loops. Those are the loops that are talking these problems over.
Now, there's someone else called the Capcom communicator. What role does that person play at this point?
Capcom is a communicator in Houston who talks to the crew occasionally, only if needed at this point. There are certain times when the Capcom will talk directly to the crew in certain milestones in the countdown, but normally it is all done with the test conductor out of the Launch Control Center. Once the launch occurs, the orbiter clears the tower, then the Capcom is the sole communicator from Houston to the orbiter throughout the rest of the flight.
Okay, so at this point, the launch commentator is communicating to us. Who's talking to Commander Brown?
The orbiter test conductor will be the one who would normally talk to the crew, relaying information about what's going on, what they're evaluating. Occasionally, they may even go to Houston to ask them for additional assistance in assessing some parameters that may be out of limits that maybe they don't have a good evaluation of that Houston might. So the Capcom in that case could be called upon to talk to them too.
Anything the crew on board has to do with, concern at this point?
Oh no, not really. It's probably just a spurious alarm, and they just want to make sure that it wasn't caused by something that could be serious. But anytime you have an alarm in a cockpit, you want to understand it completely before you give the okay to send them on the way.
You were telling me before that once you get to 9 minutes, if you pass the 9-minute mark, generally speaking, there are rare aborts are more rare.
That's true. Coming out of the 9-minute hole, and when you're on board, is pretty much the sense that, hey, they've cleared everything that they can see, and we're on our way, and it's a matter of just stepping down to actual ignition and liftoff.
The alarm that you talked about, is that something that can be viewed by the astronauts on board?
It's a light that comes on the panel of both the mission commander and the pilot, but it also has an audio tone in everybody's headset. Typically, there's a message from the computers delineating what the problem was. And in this case, I haven't heard them discussing what that was, but maybe they didn't have a message, and that's why is why it could be a spurious message.
All right. The orbiter access arm would be the next event that we would have been looking for at this time. That's a way that the astronauts can actually get off the shuttle before it has been extracted. However, there are other ways that they can be prepared for evacuations. And we'd like to show you an example of that right now, the preparations that the astronauts go through for emergency evacuation.
If something goes wrong on the launch pad, the crew has been trained to evacuate. Here's what they would do. The access arm is quickly reattached, allowing the astronauts to run to an escape basket. It takes 35 seconds to slide down a set of wires to an underground bunker 1,200 feet away.
Discovery now on final to runway
If the trouble comes later in the trip during re-entry, the astronauts must dive headfirst out of the side hatch with their parachutes already on. It takes 90 seconds to get everyone out. Since the astronauts are likely to land in the ocean, their spacesuits are equipped with built-in water survival gear. Finally, if an emergency erupts on the ground after landing, the crew can either escape down an inflatable slide or lower themselves to safety.
Now, although they are prepared for an evacuation, at this point right now we're hearing from NASA that they're doing what, polling?
They're polling the entire launch control team for each specific system for a go, and at the same time, in parallel, the flight director in Houston is doing the same thing. And as we just heard, they polled the crew at the last, and of course the crew is go, so we expect to come out of 9-minute hold any moment now.
How many different people are involved in this polling process?
I don't know, I have an exact number. There's probably 20 or so in Houston and a good 20 or 25 here, and then there's another about 6 or 7 individuals on the mission management team that are a separate set of managers that give a go as well.
So there's a pyramid process here. These are the folks who are the head of different groups. A lot of pressure on you to make sure that it's right when you give the go for launch.
At this point, though, they've all been watching the systems for hours, and they're all very comfortable with what's going on, and it's just pretty much a formality at this point.
Mm-hmm. All right, well, it looks like the countdown clock has resumed, if I'm not mistaken. We're at T-minus, looks like 8 minutes and 8 seconds and counting, if I'm not mistaken.
I think it's still holding, actually.
Are they still holding?
Yeah, I think so.
So, who gives the call after the poll has been done?
The test director will give the okay to start the clock again. They will pick a hopefully convenient time where it's on usually on the the minute at 12.
Oh, really? So you're waiting for a standard clock to be coordinate?
Usually, it just depends. Sometimes when they're in a hurry, they'll give a go immediately. But from a crew's perspective, you like it to be on an even minute so you can, because your clocks on board are all keyed to certain times from liftoff and also average times on the ground. So if they don't sync up, it makes it real tough to subtract in the air.
You've been a pilot on 2 missions and with Jerry Lininger, and I wonder if we might not go back up to Washington to the Air and Space Museum up there where Jerry is. He had to kind of sit back seat. He wasn't actually piloting the mission that you were on. I'm not sure, Jerry, if you ever were in a holding pattern like we are right now, but if you were, what did it feel like?
Actually, Blaine and I were in about a 2-hour hold because of bad weather, and we sat on our backs for about 4 hours, and right at the very end of the window, the sky opened up, a rainbow came out. We saw the hole in the sky, and we blasted off. So I've sat on there for about 2 extra hours, 4 hours total.
Well, you're describing what actually is a very beautiful day down here, so it's quite possible that, although, would Senator Glenn have a view at this stage of the game?
No, I would imagine sitting on the middeck like he is, that he would be really concerned and just looking at all those lockers around him, hoping all the fasteners hold when he does launch, because he's got a face full of lockers in the middeck that are just sitting right in front of his face, not more than maybe 20, 25 inches away.
Blaine, does a pilot or a commander feel any extra pressure at this stage of the game, like you should be doing something but you can't?
No, you realize there's nothing you can do at this point. If there is, like in this case, a master alarm, you of course will look through your procedures and see if there's anything that you might have overlooked, or check what systems you have that might be able to tell you something. But there's really not much you can do. You have to rely on the Mission Control or Launch Control Center to evaluate it and come up with the answers. And it's kind of a frustrating period because you want to go and you know it's something simple and something small, and you're just hoping that it can be resolved quickly and get you on your way.
Right. Jerry, you talked about waiting for 2 additional hours on your back. I'm curious, what is that like, lying on your back all that time?
It's not all that comfortable, to be honest with you, and you have a little pad underneath you. You can inflate and deflate and sort of help your back. You start wiggling around a bit. I actually closed my eyes for a little bit and just sort of rested my eyes. I didn't fall asleep. But you do have a little bit of time to reflect on what you're about to do.
Well, Steve, it looks like they're moving the orbiter access arm away now, so we have resumed the hold, and it looks like T-minus 7 minutes.
Now, many people refer to the orbiter access arm as a kind of an umbilical cord. That's the way you get on. That's the way you could get off if, in fact, there was some need to do so at this stage of the mission. What does it feel like when you're on board and that's going away?
Well, it's an even more lonely feeling because now you know they're really serious about lighting these candles underneath you and they're moving anything away that could get damaged by it. But the comforting thought is that within a few seconds that arm could be repositioned so that you get out and be there certainly in less time than it would take the members on the middeck to open the hatch and start piling out.
At this point in the game, the shuttle's been sitting in position for almost 6 weeks in the same spot. The fuel's been put on a little bit earlier this morning. Is it starting to feel like it's coming to life on the inside?
Yes, it does. It's really kind of an eerie feeling when you walk out there. Of course, 3 or 4 weeks ago, they had their practice countdown, and it's empty at that time, so it's just an inert vehicle out there. But when you walk out there on launch day, and you can hear the gases escaping, the hydrogen coming out of the engine bells, and it kind of creaks, it's cold, you can see ice forming, you realize it's got a life of its own. It's kind of an eerie feeling.
Now, they've just made another announcement that they're going to have another hold, which is quite unusual at T-5, and that's because there's an aircraft in the area.
Yeah, we get frustrated a lot of times, although there are a lot of extensive notices put out on the airwaves for airmen as well as for operators of ships that are supposed to avoid a certain area around the Cape during launch time. We always have the occasional straggler that comes in, and then we have to wait till they get out because of the danger involved in being in the local area during a launch in case something should happen, or just just be involved in the flight path.
Sure. We're being reminded now that there's a 2.5-hour window for the flight to take off. That means that they've only got until 4:30 for the launch to actually take place. Why would it cease after that?
Well, there could be many constraints. Some of the constraints could be to the mission elements involving one of their satellites. Little Spartan may have some elements of its orbit that it has to be within, but normally the 2.5-hour window is typically for just crew rest. We restrict the crew's time on their back to a total of about 5 hours, a little over 5 hours, I think 15 minutes. So by the time you've been on board, the commander's been on board just a little over 3 or close to 3 hours, and a 2.5-hour hold is usually the reason. There could be other things such as weather or daylighting conditions at the overseas abort sites.
The female voice that you may have been hearing in the background is Lisa Malone. She is the launch commentator, and I think we can get a picture of her if I'm not mistaken. Certainly we can hear her voice there in the background. And we may or may not be able to get a picture. Is that launch control there?
That's Launch Control Center there, one of the firing rooms.
Now inside there, that's where is that where the flight director would be taking the poll, or would that be back at mission control?
Well, the flight director back in mission control is doing his poll, or actually her poll, Linda Ham, it sounds like. But here the NASA test director and the launch director, Bob Seek, would be there doing their polling.
The launch team here
oftentimes in the past, when people are observing the shuttle in position, you see what looks like smoke coming out of what looks like engines at the bottom of the shuttle. Not so at this point.
Well, no, there's nothing going on other than the fact that the engine bells are being cooled by the very fuel that it will use to ignite it. The fuel hydrogen is extremely cold. It's almost over minus 400 degrees. And as you might imagine, the ignition process creates very high heat. So in order to protect the engine bells from that heat, they cool it with this hydrogen. They run it through some cooling tubes, and then they exhaust out one of the pipes on the end of the bell.
So this is hydrogen burn-off at the bottom?
Yes, it's just a hydrogen gas being emitted outside the engine.
Okay. Let's take a look at we observe the shuttle right now in front of us there. The two huge solid rocket boosters on either side. That's something that we may have seen with Bill Blakemore a little bit close up when we did the comparison with Friendship 7. That's where the majority of the fuel is located.
Well, that's actually, there's two types of rockets. We have the solid rockets, as you see here, which are fueled by a kind of a material that looks like a pencil eraser, if you will. And it's, there's a hole down the center of each one of the solids that's the cavity where the fire transfers. They actually light from the top and travel down, and then are contained in the combustion chamber at the end and then exhausted out as the rocket exhausts. On the other hand, the three main engines of the shuttle are fueled by liquid hydrogen and oxygen, which are carried in the main tank, the big orange structure attached to the orbiter.
Now, is that called the external tank?
The external tank, right.
That doesn't stay with the shuttle as it goes off?
No, that is pretty much empty when we get to orbit and the engines quit. We separate from that, and that is eventually returns back to the Earth and burns up into oblivion, essentially, and is destroyed.
The solid rocket boosters are necessary to get the thrust needed to propel the shuttle into space, but there's a certain amount of danger involved in that from a pilot standpoint.
Well, yeah, the solids are something that once you turn them on, you can't turn them off, and so once they light, you're pretty much going to go wherever they decide you're going to go, and you rely on the computers to be able to steer them. But if something were to go wrong, that the crew on board has no control over whether those things can be turned off or not, so you have to wait till they burn out.
All right, we're continuing in a temporary hold here at Kennedy Space Center. We'll return with more of Discovery News when we return.
And when we come back, turning the body into a 24-hour-a-day laboratory. What John Glenn will be telling scientists while he's awake and asleep. Plus, fighter pilot, astronaut, politician,
hearing will be in order,
American hero, taking stock of John Glenn's legacy.
John Glenn, A Pioneer Returns continues. Once again, Steve Avison.
Welcome back to this special edition of Discovery News. We're at a hold here, a 5-minute hold, waiting for the launch of Shuttle Discovery. And Blaine, they talked about something called the Superintendent of Range Operations, who will go out and try to intercept or, you know, clear the airspace.
Yeah, Steve, there's a big block of airspace around Cape Canaveral and Kennedy Space Center, which is set aside for launch operations. And typically during any launch, not just us, but any of the Air Force launches, is supposed to be sterilized for a launch, as we just talked about earlier. And unfortunately, occasionally you'll have some pilot who didn't get the word and comes flying through looking for a better view. And of course, it's very annoying for the crew because everything's working perfectly, and you have to wait for this renegade who have to be, you know, shooed away by one of the security forces here. But they'll have it taken care of. The superintendent's the person in charge who either will authorize a helicopter or some other aircraft to try to make contact and get this individual out of the way.
Now, there was another brief hold earlier. Launch commentator Lisa Malone is telling us that at the T-minus 5-minute holding position, we can last for up to 2 hours before launch.
Right. Until you start the APUs, you pretty much got an indefinite hold. But once the APUs start, you're limited by the amount of fuel you carry for them, and so you can't burn them too long before you have to shut down and come back another day.
Knowing how competitive John Glenn has been with his mates from the Mercury mission days, does this count as extra hours of airtime, or does it only when you cross into space?
No, it doesn't count till the wicks light and you're on your way. That's flight time.
All right. This mission is scheduled to last 9 days, and just about every second is packed with work for the astronauts. In just a few hours, hopefully, John Glenn will begin his experiments. Ned Potter has a report.
By the time he goes to bed tonight, Glenn will have 21 different lines attached to his head and body to record how well he sleeps in space. But astronauts often have trouble sleeping, as do many older people. So in addition to the sleep net on his head, which Glenn will wear to monitor brainwave activity, there's a tiny radio transmitter to measure his temperature.
And since you've swallowed it, it's your core body temperature.
There's a vest to record the rise and fall of his chest, a little fingertip monitor to measure the oxygen level in his blood, even a motion sensor on his wrist to record how restless he is before he nods off. Muscle loss is another problem shared by astronauts in space and the elderly on the ground.
The body uses the muscle as a stored source of energy. So lean body mass, nitrogen is lost.
Glenn's second major experiment will study how the protein in his muscles is broken down under the stress of weightlessness. By the time he lands, Glenn will have provided 24 urine and blood samples. Glenn will also take part in 8 other experiments, measuring changes in his body such as balance, bone density, heart rate, and blood pressure.
All of these are things that occur to the younger people in space, and it also occurs to the elderly right here.
Glenn hopes these experiments will help answer questions we all want to know. What makes our bodies age? Ned Potter, ABC News.
All right, they have just restarted the count moments ago, Blaine?
And that's great news. Yeah, they've just given the go for APU start. Of course, the APUs provide all the hydraulics for the gimbling of the main engines and the flight control system, which is pretty much like the heart and the circulatory system of the orbiter, if you will.
So the computer's the brain, the
APUs provide
our boosters of the muscle, the APUs.
Are the circulatory system. They provide the muscle that moves the thrusters and the flight control systems, and they can't be moved without the hydraulics.
Well, we keep on talking about what people are feeling on the inside. Jerry Lineker up at the Aerospace Museum up in Washington. When the shuttle starts to come alive at this point, I'm sure with the APUs kicking in, the hydraulics kicking in, making sure the engines can gimbal properly, are you starting to feel it where you sit?
Oh no, you're starting to feel that the thing is alive and that you're going to go somewhere, and actually your adrenaline starts flowing a little bit. You say, hey, this is for real, it's showtime. And it's a great sensation when things start coming alive in the shuttle.
What kind of sounds do you hear, I wonder? I mean, is it, you know, science fiction tells me that you hear screeching metal and whistles and
you don't want to hear screeching metal. It's more smooth motions. Actually, you can actually feel the engines when they start to gimbal. You can hear the steam escaping. It's kind of like a dragon letting off steam.
All right, it's T-minus 3 minutes, 30 seconds, and counting. The shuttle hydraulics have begun to maneuver the engines into their position.
Yeah, we're beginning to see now the engine bells starting to go through a pre-programmed set of maneuvers to make sure that they're free in all directions, that there isn't any hang-up to it.
This so-called gimbling has to do with actually steering the shuttle.
Right. The way the orbiter is steered on its way to orbit is through the gimbling of the two rocket motors primarily, but also the main engines can provide some steering, vectoring, if you will, or thrust direction.
So you're a pilot, but you're not doing much piloting.
You're along for the ride. It's a great ride.
When is it that you would start to take over control as a pilot?
We don't take over at all on the ascent list as a problem. We let the computers do it because they can do it much more efficiently than we can.
All right, we're T-minus 2 minutes, just under 40 seconds and counting. This is about the time when we would expect to see the oxygen vent hood be removed from the top of the shuttle, affectionately known as the beanie cap. What's going on at this point?
Well, at that point, they've decided, as you see it now, the cap, all it is more or less a relief valve for oxygen vapors to escape from the oxygen tank. At this point, they close off that relief valve and let the tank come up to operating pressure, their normal pressure, and it moves out of the way again, so it's not in the way of the launch, and the tanks are now being pressurized so they can provide fuel at the right flow rates to the engines.
All right, we want to give people a preview of what they can look for in the final seconds leading up to a shuttle launch. A lot happens in a short time. Here's a sense of what you can look for. At T-minus 16 seconds, the deck of the launch pad is flooded with 300,000 gallons of water to absorb the sound waves which would otherwise bounce off the concrete launch pad and damage the shuttle. At T-minus 10 seconds, you'll see sparks in the engine nozzles. Those are not the engines starting, but instead small flares intentionally set off to burn away excess hydrogen gas that might have built up. Too much hydrogen could cause an explosion at liftoff. At T-minus 6.6 seconds, the main engines start and have exactly 3 seconds to build up to 90% thrust. If they don't get there, they're turned off and the launch is scrubbed. At T-minus 0, the solid rocket boosters are ignited. Lane, there's been a couple of postponements. What does it feel like for you at this point, waiting to go up?
Well, you just keep hoping nothing's going to go wrong. You want it to count down and go without a hitch, and you know, it's just like the greatest amusement park ride you can think of, and you're like the guy in line, next in line, you want to make sure it doesn't break.
Let's listen to Lisa Malone, launch commentator, as John Glenn prepares his return to space.
The countdown clock will continue.
VLS's go for auto sequence start.
Discovery's onboard computers now have control of vehicle functions. T-minus 20 seconds. T-minus 15. T-minus 10, 9, 8. We have a go for engine start. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Booster ignition and liftoff of Discovery with a crew of 6 astronaut heroes and 1 American legend.
Houston Discovery, roll program.
Roger, roll, Discovery.
Roger, go ahead, throttle up.
Never fail to be stirred by this.
One minute and 50 seconds into the flight. Discovery now at an altitude of 25 miles, traveling at a speed of 2,900 miles an hour. The next event will be burnout and separation of Discovery's twin solid rocket boosters.
And now you're watching those solid rocket boosters. What does it feel like playing at that point?
Houston, 2-engine Banjul.
Copy, 2-engine Banjul.
It's great relief when the boosters go away.
Capcom Susan Still informing the crew that in the event of a single engine failure,
Houston, performance nominal.
Performance nominal. That's a great call. Everything's working well.
Discovery could now reach the transatlantic abort site at Banjul. However, telemetry indicating all 3 engines continuing to perform well, and Discovery's performance to this point, 2.5 minutes into the flight, has been as expected. Discovery now traveling at a speed of 3,500 miles per hour at an altitude of 43 miles, downrange from the Kennedy Space Center, 70 miles. All systems are continuing to perform well.
Clouds are missing.
It's a remarkable visual sight, but Blaine, I had no idea what it would feel like. It shakes you right through to your chest.
It really stirs at your soul to feel this thing go off. It's just an indication of the immense power that's sitting under you when you're going, and you really don't feel that when you're sitting on the pad. I mean, you feel the power behind you, but it's even more impressive when you're actually watching a launch to know what all is involved and the power behind it to make it all happen. It's just incredible.
There are a couple of different stages that you were remarking on earlier in terms of what you feel like as the rocket lifts off the pad.
Well, yeah, the first thing is the biggest surprise for me as a new guy, and probably John Glenn might have not remembered as much as he thought he would, but 3-man engines lighting off is not an easy event by any stretch of the imagination, and it really just shakes the whole orbit apart, feels like, and then when the solids light, it feels like the whole, I mean, you just look out the window and see the whole world drop away. This thing really gets up and goes.
They just mentioned negative return. That's a standard call. What does it mean?
That's a normal call. What that means, Steve, is that the orbiter is too fast and too far downrange to turn. If they should lose an engine, their board option of coming back here is no longer, they don't have the capability to do that. But they can still go over to one of their overseas abort sites if an engine order failed at this point.
So they have 4 other alternate transatlantic landing sites?
Right.
And that's Banjul, the Gambia, Moran, Spain, Zaragoza, Spain, and will you pronounce it for me?
Ben Gurir, Morocco.
Ben Gurir, Morocco. Why do we pick those spots?
Well, it's because they're good runway sites. Banjul is primary because it's most closely lined up under the orbital path of the orbiter as it's going off now. So it would require the least amount of performance for them to get there if they lose an engine or 2 engines.
Well, I know that if we could feel it very strongly here, out in Titusville all morning, Barry Serafin has been visiting with people who are, as we watch this replay take place. Barry, what did it look like out your way? And more importantly, what did it feel like out in Titusville with people who've been there so many times before?
Well, Steve, we're about 10 miles away from the launch pad here. It was really interesting because as we went into the little holes, the crowd became more and more silent. Everyone was on his feet. Everyone was watching. And when it finally went, there was some cheering, but it remained silent. It was almost an awestruck silence. And as the word came through that everything was normal, the cheering began, some flags were waved, and it was just a great day, I think, for all these thousands of people who turned out here.
Barry Serafin, thank you. Let's go up to the Air and Space Museum up in Washington. Jerry Lininger, you expressed a little jealousy earlier that John Glenn was getting to go up, and you'd like to go up once again. How did you feel looking at it up there?
Oh man, people here are cheering and yelling, and that's exactly how I felt. Just go, John, go, and go, crew, and it's, you know, to me it's breathtaking watching a United States space shuttle get into space.
We're about 3 miles away from the launch pad here, Blaine. Bill Blakemore is about 10 miles away, I think, if I'm not mistaken, over at the visitor center. And Bill Blakemore, you were at one point standing next to something that was just like the shuttle, but yours doesn't take off.
We saw it from 8 1/4 miles. In fact, from here, it's the first time I've seen it take off. I've never seen anything so bright. John Pike, as a space analyst, space policy analyst, how did it strike you?
Well, this is one of the smoothest launches I've seen, and I think the bottom line is you really do have to be here to see how absolutely incredibly impressive it is.
I'm surprised that NASA doesn't let more people in to get a little bit closer.
Oh, I think that they're really missing a bet by not letting people see how tremendously impressive this is. You really have to be here to see this.
We heard the ground shaking, we felt the ground shaking, and it was like there was a million trains here. Steve?
We sure felt it here, Bill. You know, John Pike just made mention of a smooth takeoff. Is there a difference between one takeoff and another?
Well, no, not really. In terms, I think he was referring more to the countdown process of getting here. The weather was perfect. The orbiter was perfect. There were no hitches to speak of, other than the one temporary one there. But it was really a very smooth, very easy countdown by all accounts. And but every launch feels just that powerful, that impressive. But I wanted Jerry to come on board and tell him about his analogy. I always thought it was very humorous, his description of what it felt like from his perspective to ride it up.
Jerry Lineger, you're up there in Washington at the Air and Space Museum. I'm sure that if we had microphones up there, people would love to hear you tell this story. What did it feel like for you first time up?
You know, my first time up, it felt, and I still stick with this after my second flight, it felt like I was in a herd of charging buffalo. They were going to go where they wanted to go. It was charging. Things were violent. You were being shaken back and forth. And I actually got a big smile on my face, and I said, man, this beast is going wherever it wants, and there's not a darn thing we're going to do about it. Once the solids come off, it smooths out very much, and then it's like being in a dragster, just a slick acceleration, getting jammed back into your seat.
Now, we're approaching a point, Jerry and Blaine, where the external tank is nearly empty, and they're about ready to release those. That's yet another important stage in terms of G-forces, in terms of the speed of the shuttle.
Absolutely, Steve. The shuttle, of course, is accelerating continuously here because the weight's burning down. In fact, if you didn't throttle the engines back, it would just continue to accelerate beyond the 3G limit. So the throttles will actually come back, the engines will throttle down to hold 3 Gs, which is pressing the crew into their seats. And then at managing cutoff time, very precisely, the engines shut off instantaneously. I mean, it's not like you coast to a stop sign. It's like a switch on and switch off, and you get slammed into the straps like you're almost getting thrown in the opposite direction. But of course you're not. It just feels that way.
All right, they just confirmed that the main engine cutoff has taken place and the separation of the external tank has taken place. I'd like to talk with Dr. White, Dr. Ronald White at Mission Control in Houston. Dr. White, at this stage of the game, there's a big change in the G-forces that John Glenn and his fellow astronauts are feeling on board. Is this something that might be measured right now or in future by NASA in terms of how it's affecting this 77-year-old astronaut?
Well, they've already done these kinds of measurements on other flights, and what happens is that the compression from the G-forces squeezes the body, and the vibration during this period before main engine cutoff shakes the body around quite a bit. It's an extremely stressful experience, but the senator and all the crew have passed all the required physicals, and they can withstand this very easily.
All right, Dr. White, thank you very much. We're going to take a quick break, but it's now time to say that John Glenn has become the oldest man in space. We'll return in a moment. Welcome back to Discovery News, where we're taking the measure of an historic day in space exploration. John Glenn has become the oldest astronaut in space. The next important event is going to take place in about 40 minutes. That's when the shuttle is maneuvered into its proper orbit. Bill Redeker, ABC News correspondent, is at Mission Control in Houston. Bill, what happens after that?
Steve, it's a critical step. The next step is that the payload bay doors must open either automatically or manually, or else the crew must abort the mission and land within 8 hours. And the reason is because by opening those doors, these heat radiators release energy, or in the form of heat, up to 500 degrees away from the space shuttle so that they can maintain a constant and cool temperature of about 68 degrees. So it's a critical time.
All right, Bill, thanks very much. Blaine, question to you. Is it ever an issue? Have the cargo doors never opened? Has there ever been a time when that's been a problem?
No, they haven't. They've always opened as advertised. We've had an occasional moment, I don't remember the missions, where we had some concern about them closing, but they always function like they're supposed to.
All right, very good. All right, we're going to go to Ned Potter now. Whatever the space program gains from this mission, it is a dream come true for John Glenn, an ordinary man from a small town in Ohio who has accomplished extraordinary things. Ned Potter reports. All right, we don't have that tape, but what we're just overhearing from NASA here, Blaine, is the flight director. Is that him just thanking his mates for a job well done as he's now been transferred to Houston?
The launch director, that's correct. They're through with their part of the mission. They've gotten the space shuttle launched safely, and they're now through until the orbiter comes back, and at which point they'll pick it up off the runway and bring it back here to...
Now, launch control passes from Kennedy Space Center to mission control in Houston at what point?
As soon as the orbiter clears the tower, that's the official transition point. At that point, anything that happens becomes responsibility of Houston. For instance, the return to launch site, which we mentioned earlier, the negative return. If the orbiter were to have a problem, return to launch site, Houston would control that, and they would talk them down, even though it would be coming back here to Kennedy Space Center.
Who does the communicating with
Capcom.
the shuttle command? Capcom.
Capcom and only Capcom.
You've done that before.
Yes, I have.
How long does, I mean, is it that there's shifts? It's going to be 8 days. Is there, you pass the baton from time to time?
Yeah, when you're around the clock when you're in mission control. If you're a Capcom, we divide into shifts. I was an ascent entry Capcom for many years, which is a good deal because you're on duty for the launch and then you come back in for landing. And typically the orbit Capcoms do the bulk of the mission, 8 hours on, and then just rotate around the clock. But yeah, it's a 24-hour on-duty sort of detail.
Well, it's a tremendous opportunity for everyone, and I thought that Lisa Malone captured it well when she said 6 heroes into space and 1 legend. That was wonderful. Ned Potter has a story about that legend.
Being pilot, he won the Distinguished Flying Cross 5 times. As a test pilot, he established a transcontinental speed record. But first and foremost, John Glenn is an astronaut, the astronaut. In 1962, when he became the first American to orbit the Earth in Friendship 7, Glenn returned a hero.
He was outgoing, and he cut a very dashing figure. He's ambitious. He's an attractive fellow.
Because of his fame, Glenn was never sent back to space.
I didn't know till sometime later that apparently President Kennedy had preferred that I not be used again right away.
He left NASA for the Senate, where he served for 24 years. But the entire time, he held on to a dream to fly again as an astronaut. Today, 36 years later, the nation is a little older, a little less idealistic, but it seems excited to fly once more with John Glenn. Ned Potter, ABC News.
Goosebumps. You are looking at the launch as seen this afternoon about 2:20 in the afternoon Eastern Standard Time at the Air and Space Museum in Washington, D.C. We have one final thought that we'd like to share before we leave you today. As a payload specialist, one of John Glenn's primary duties will be to document the mission, to film the crew and the progress of their experiments. Ironically, the man who has been so much in the spotlight, the focus of all the cameras, will now be the astronaut behind them. I'd like to thank all of our guests. Blaine Hammond, thanks a lot. Let's do it again sometime, shall we?
Steve, anytime. I loved it. Thank you.
And all of our ABC News correspondents, we thank you so much for viewing us today. Worldwide Discovery Channel viewers will now return to regular programming. For those of you in the United States, stay tuned for Return to Orbit, 3 hours about a space exploration. I'm Steve Avison. Thank you for joining us on Discovery News.